Again, it is important to remember that this is not a science paper. It is a philosophy paper. You are not so much being tested on your scientific knowledge as you are your understanding of how science affects religious belief and the religious responses to scientific discovery. You will need to be able to consider whether or not scientific views are compatible with the religious and how they differ in the ways that they come to their theories. Darwin was originally planning to enter the clergy. His rejection of this path in life had less to do with his development of the theory of evolution and more to do with family issues. He did not originally reject the idea of a purposeful creator, suggesting that he felt that there probably was a God, but that he didn't trust the minds of beings that developed from such basic organisms to come to such grand conclusions. In fact, his final rejection of God was more to do with the death of his daughter than his scientific discoveries. Darwin established the idea of natural selection, which says that characteristics that give a creature a survival advantage are more likely to be passed on to offspring than characteristics that are undesirable. This is because if a characteristic helps a creature to survive, they're more likely to be alive to mate and pass on that characteristic than any other creature. In fact, through this process, a species can develop and evolve slowly by passing on increasingly advantageous characteristics. This was called survival of the fittest by Herbert Spencer. The characteristics that might be developed in order to be passed on can be simply as a result of random variations. A creature that is larger and can reach more food might be more likely to survive longer. This line of development means that human beings can trace back their ancestry over millions of years to more primitive life forms. At one stage, ape-like creatures featured in our lineage, and then simpler creatures than that. A good example, often given in biology lessons, is that of the peppered moth during the Industrial Revolution. Prior to this, moths that were speckled and brown would have had a high chance of survival due to effective camouflage against the bark of trees. Predators would not be able to see them, and so they would be more likely to survive and thus mate and continue the species. During the Industrial Revolution, the bark of trees became black as a result of pollution from the new factories. There was a huge problem in the cities with smog, and the air was filthy with smoke. Brown speckled moths were clearly visible against the trunks of the trees now, and so were quickly spotted and eaten by birds. However, those moths that by chance happened to be plainer and darker had a characteristic that enabled them to be fit enough for survival. Thus they went on to mate and pass on their dark characteristic to their offspring. The pale moths gradually became fewer and fewer. Had this state of affairs continued, then eventually all pale moths would eventually become extinct, and the dark moths would have been the norm. This would be a tiny step in the process of evolution. In fact, after a number of years, human beings found ways of cleaning up the pollution and producing less contaminants. Thus the trees regained their colour, and the black moths became visible to predators again. Thus the chance paler moths were better able to survive and pass on their genes. Potentially, all this means that there is no need for a creator or designer, since humanity can have just evolved from lower life forms just through the workings of this process rather than as a result of a plan. There is no fixity of species. Development can occur and cause a species to change beyond recognition given enough time. All this appears to be dependent upon the particular environment that a species happened to exist within, rather than on the intervention of an intelligent being. This appears to directly contradict the idea that God created us in our current form. It also places humanity on a level with all other animals, as opposed to being special or separate. The theory is supported by empirical evidence. The fossil record shows that millions of years ago, animals looked very different than they do today, and in fact species have changed or died out rather than being fixed from the outset. This is not the only response, however. Whilst it seems that evolution is in direct conflict with religion, there is no need for it to be. Theories such as intelligent design might postulate that there can be a creator behind the process of evolution, or that evolution could work for the most part, but there are aspects of human development that evolution cannot explain, and so God is responsible for those. He is needed to initiate it or support its working. Others argue that irreducible complexity shows that evolution cannot explain the existence of some features of life on Earth, such as the blood clotting system, for instance. We will look at these ideas in more detail in another film. Still others might see God as a creative force, responsible for the continuous process of creation, rather than some cosmic intervener. Here they might argue that God hasn't so much kick-started evolution as he has been responsible for the whole continued process of it. Some, of course, would reject evolutionary theory altogether and say that while scientists cite evidence to support their thinking, their evidence is flawed and unreliable. Instead, such believers might refer to Scripture as a higher authority. Whatever the response, it seems that Darwin's work has not made God impossible. Richard Dawkins would entirely reject any religious interpretation of evolutionary theory. He has written numerous books which explain how we can look to genes to explain human development rather than to a god. He claims that evolution works entirely to explain all things. There is no gap left for God to fit into, and no need for a religious interpretation of the data. In The Selfish Gene, he writes that evolution works on a genetic level. We are merely large vehicles to carry genes around, and the main purpose of evolution is to allow genes to be able to replicate themselves. This is all they desire. Any characteristic that is advantageous to gene survival and thus replication is useful to the genes. Human beings are not valuable in themselves, only as a vehicle for gene survival. He claims life is just bytes and bytes of digital information. Dawkins develops this further into meme theory. He claims that ideas are simply units of culture, memes, which are capable of being passed on through the same evolutionary principles. Religion is just a very successful meme, a virus of the mind. This idea explains morality, culture, and any ideas which might point to as evidence of human beings being higher than any other life forms and thus originated from God. Dawkins simply explains all these things as being a product of the same evolutionary principles. Dawkins provides us with evidence of his development of Darwinism in his book The Blind Watchmaker. Here he worked in conjunction with Ted Carler of Apple to develop a computer simulation whereby biomorphs were produced by simply allowing the program to operate. The purpose of this was to demonstrate a misunderstanding that many have of evolutionary principles. Many understand evolution in a way that focuses on randomness and chance. As a result, they feel the need to look to a god to be responsible for it. They claim that the likelihood of something so complex and coherent coming about by chance just seems so unlikely. Dawkins began by taking a line of a Shakespeare play, "Methinks it is like a weasel," and using a computer program to randomly select combinations of the letters. This showed the probability of chance placing all the characters in the right order. This is a variation of the infinite monkey theorem, which states that, given infinite time, monkeys with typewriters could construct the complete works of Shakespeare just by bashing randomly on the keys. This argument was used by some to argue the universe complete with human life can come about just as a result of chance. Here, though, Dawkins makes it easier on the monkeys. He points out that with a simpler sentence we can more easily do the maths. In fact, he shows that just using random variation, it is extremely unlikely that the phrase would ever be created. It takes millions of combinations before the simulation arrives at the correct one. However, if we use cumulative selection, then the work is completed much more quickly. In fact, it was completed while they were out at lunch, and so there is no need to resort to a god as a result. What this means is that nature, or in this case the computer, can learn from its previous selections. Here, if a combination is successful, it is not abandoned. It is retained and built upon. This is much more akin to the real process of evolution and survival of the fittest. Dawkins then went on to show how with two-dimensional line drawings, using the same processes of cumulative selection, biomorphs can become increasingly complex to the point that they resemble insects very closely. Thus, there is no need for a creator or designer to bring about complexity and order. In fact, these things can arise out of the simple processes of evolution, which operate unguided by a cosmic hand. This clearly is intentionally in direct opposition to a religious response. For Christians, humans are the pinnacle of creation, and they are made in the image of God. They are valuable and important, but if Dawkins is right, then none of this is in reality the case. For Dawkins, evolutionary theory can explain everything about life on Earth with no need at all to refer to an intelligent designer or a divine first cause. Even those aspects of morality and faith that some would cite as evidence of God can be explained away using evolution, since meme theory encompasses that. It seems hard to conceive of how a religious response could recover from this. However, once again, there may be a range of responses from religion. Obviously, there are those who would, for reasons of faith, deny Dawkins' ideas outright. He may be seen as offering an atheist perspective or an interpretation of data rather than an unbiased account of evolutionary theory. His computer simulation, after all, needed an intelligent designer to program the computer to begin with and to guide it in the right way so it might learn from its successes and failures. Those that deny evolution would reject any part of this theory completely and refer back to scripture anyway. However, we can also look to those who accept evolution and scientific methodology. It is claimed by some, both religious and atheist, that Dawkins takes his understanding of evolution too far. He makes the claim that it operates in the same way on every part of life, including the workings of our conscious and unconscious minds, whereas some would argue that this is not the case. We may not have a complete understanding of evolutionary theory yet. It's not wrong, it's just basic, and evolution may be far more complex. There may be yet room for a God, although this is not necessarily a God that is like a bigger version of people.